Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 35 of the podcast. In this episode, I interview Sam Luce, and Sam and I talk about the tension between entertainment and discipleship when it comes to serving and leading kids. And Sam talks about this from a unique perspective because he's been at the same church for almost 2 decades. And so he's been able to see kind of the fruit of the different ways that he's led throughout, his time leading in ministry and what that resulted in. So it's a great conversation. You'll get a lot out of it, whether you lead children's ministry or student ministry. It really applies to both. Be sure to check out the show notes as usual at nickblevins.com/episode 35. And before we jump in, if you are looking for the results of that survey, I promise they're coming out soon. Sorry it has taken me this long. The good news is a ton of you filled it out, which is great. The survey about staffing ratios in children's ministry and student ministry, as well as volunteer numbers, all that kind of stuff. It's just taking a lot longer than I thought to clean up that data and then get to analyze it and all that stuff. But it'll be coming out soon for sure. But be on the lookout for that. And also, if you could, I'd love for you to leave a rating and a review for this podcast on iTunes if it's your first time listening, or maybe you've listened to every episode. I'd love for you to leave a review and a rating on iTunes and just say, what it means to you, how it's been helpful, and that'll help get it in front of other leaders, and I really appreciate that. So without further ado, let's jump into my interview with Sam Luce. Well, today I'm joined by Sam Luce. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Sam, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your church.
My name's Sam Luce. I'm a family pastor in upstate New York. I oversee all the kids and youth ministries at all of our campuses, and I'm the kids pastor at our original campus. And I've been here for 19 years, and I've been married to my wife for 18. We have 4 kids. My wife was born and raised in Canada, just outside Toronto, and we met in Bible college. And our kids range from 12 years old to 3. So
that's awesome.
It's busy. Yeah, it's a little busy.
Yeah, definitely. I bet. I can imagine. And so you like you said, you've been there 19 years, coming up on 2 decades. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
And leading children's ministry, you've been a campus pastor and leading family ministry for the church overall, but you've largely been connected to children's ministry for most of that time.
Yeah.
What is one of the biggest things, or some of the biggest things that you've learned in 2 decades leading in ministry, especially in the same area? That's pretty rare.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think it's Nick. I think one of the things that's unique about it is that it gives you this window into your successes and failures that you don't have. Because you see the end results of your decisions that were good decisions and bad decisions, because you're there to see the kids that you led in preschool become parents and put their own kids in preschool, and you see where you failed them and where you succeeded. And I think it gives you like this humble confidence. It humbles you because you realize that you made a lot of mistakes, and then it gives you confidence knowing that God worked through you and in your church in ways you couldn't have ever imagined. And I think that's where the confidence comes from, I think it's a challenge, definitely to lead in the same place for so long, because, you have unique challenges that you wouldn't have if you were starting over, but I think it's good. I think it creates for me, at least, it's created a huge dependence on the person of and work of Christ, because you realize that your triumphs and your victories are not through good strategy, but they're through the grace and the mercy and the goodness of God at work in you and through you.
When you're there that long, you probably also see some things you did. You mentioned this, like things that worked out well, things that didn't. You probably had to totally change or scrap things you created.
Yeah,
because maybe they did work. Maybe it did work, and it was a great season, and it was perfect for where the church was. And then all of a sudden, down the road, it's your idea, and it's like that's not a good idea anymore. Maybe, right?
No, totally. And I think part of that was like my approach to reaching kids. When I started, I was very much like my thrust was, how can I make it fun and exciting in such a way that kids will want to come and they'll want to bring their friends, which is a total great way to approach ministry. But if that is your primary and sole focus, without having the understanding of we want to connect them to the person and work of Christ, it becomes imbalanced and not good, And I think I came to a point when I was probably about 10 years in that I just I felt like I'd accomplished all the things that I felt that God had placed in my heart to accomplish in kids ministry, and I started thinking, God, what do you want me to do next? And I started just kind of reflecting over a decade of ministry in the same church, and I started to realize that I had I think an unhealthy viewpoint of like making church fun and making it about exciting and trying to get more people to come without figuring out how can we connect them to something that will last longer than fun lingers. You know what I mean? And that for me, that was a big change. You know what I mean? When I started to realize that I hadn't preached the gospel as clearly as I should have or I could have. It was a very sobering reality to come to.
Now, do you feel like there was, I don't know if success is the right word, but the fun approach and drawing kids in probably worked in a sense in terms of people showing up and kids liking it? Where did it show up that it was like, well, maybe it's just still something missing? Like this isn't really working. It just looks like it's working. Did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to. I think that the whole idea, like with success, is easy to get caught up into because it's you're counting people. It's like this many people came. This week this many people came the next week, and there's nothing wrong with counting people at all. I mean, I think it's, but it goes more to the to me. I think what it's become, what I've realized is what is my motivation behind counting? Am I counting because I want to know how many people came, or am I counting to find out who's missing? And I think that is the difference. I wrote a blog post a while about the difference between like a CEO and a pastor, and I think that's one of the big differences. I think CEOs are looking for a bottom line, and a pastor is more concerned about the people that are making the widget rather than the widget itself.
Yeah. Practically, did you change what kind of changes did you put in place to take it from something that was fun and engaging and welcoming? And obviously you were teaching the Bible. It's not like it was just, Disney.
No, not at all. No, it wasn't.
How did you lean it more that way and away maybe from just being too much the other way?
Yeah, well, I think part of it came down to it was this idea of what is their takeaway? You know what I mean? That was, for me, it was the bottom line. Like, what is the bottom line takeaway that these kids are going to walk away with? And for me, I wanted it to be that Jesus is everything, that he's enough. And I think part of the way that I taught in the past, it was still, I still taught the Bible. We didn't not teach the Bible. It was about trying to outdo ourselves week in and week out and trying to figure out, okay, how can we make this more exciting? How can we get more kids to come? How can we do this? And we still do this. I mean, this year we're going to be doing some outreaches that are very much focused at fun only. You know what I'm saying? And so we're not anti that. I'm just saying, I think it became an obsession where it was like, how can we get more kids coming, and how can we do that in such a way that we missed what was important, and that was that kids need to understand that the world is broken, that Jesus redeems, and that Jesus restores. And I think that if they don't understand, the whole understanding of the gospel is more than Jesus came to save you. It is that, but it's the Bible is painting for us a picture of the story of redemption from beginning to end. And I don't think kids got that because, and I think that is what teenagers and children need to understand more than anything, is this beautiful story of redemption, that God created a perfect world. We broke it. God redeemed it, and he's coming one day to restore it. And I think when they see that it's this story behind, when they see the story behind the story, and I think that's where I failed, Nick, was that I taught the stories of the Bible, but I never taught them the story behind the story. Is I taught them, about Abraham and about, the three Hebrew children. I taught them the stories, but I didn't teach them the story behind the story. And I think that's what kids need in order to be successful in life. And even as they head into college, is that they need to know more than about the Bible. They need to know the person who wrote the Bible, the story, who's the author of the story behind the story.
Let me ask you this, because in children's ministry, most churches are using some kind of curriculum, And curriculums have different styles, methods, approaches. We talked about this. I had Jeff Reed on the podcast recently, and he was talking about how Lifeway actually makes curriculum designed for 3 different approaches. So if your church takes kind of a verse by verse through the Bible approach, we have that. If you want to be really gospel centered, you have the Gospel Project. If you want to be topical, they have that too. But in children's ministry, because there is a huge focus in a good way on teaching the Bible, what that can mean is a lot of times you're not talking about the gospel and Jesus, or like you're saying, the bigger picture. How did you get that in there more? Because I think sometimes leaders, that they do wrestle with that. Are we talking about Jesus and the gospel enough? Are we tying this into the bigger picture enough? But they're not sure how to do it. What did you do there? How did you try to change that?
Well, I think it started with a change in me. It first started with me, and I think that's where it always starts, is with God transforming the heart of a leader. And I went through about 10 years ago, I went through a really difficult season in my life personally, and it was through that season that I came to a greater understanding, I think personally, just of who God is, and I began to see the story behind the story, through different people that God led into my lives and different books I'd read, and it led me to see that what I had missed my whole life, and I was still a Christian. It wasn't that I wasn't a Christian. It wasn't anything. It was an aspect of who God was. It was like almost a facet to the diamond. Like you see, if you turn it in different lights, you see different facets. And it was like a facet of who God was that I'd missed. And for us, it's you're right. There is so many different curriculums, and over the last, 9 to 10 years, we've used different curriculums. But what has always stayed the same is this: whenever I meet with our teachers weekly, and I say, here's what we're trying to get across to the kids. Here's what we need to know, and here's what they need to know. And I always bring it back to, okay, so what has God done for us through Christ? That is what we need to. The Old Testament stories are always pointing to the cross, to say in hopeful anticipation of a Savior, and the New Testament is always pointing back to the cross, in recognition of Christ as our Savior. And I think that if we keep that in mind, and every story that we tell, it is a story of redemption. I mean, when you look at stories, even the hard stories that you read in the Old Testament, some of the hard ones, I think one of the most powerful stories that we've done, one of the most powerful Bible stories that we've told recently in our kids' church is the story of Hosea and Gomer, which you would kind of pause at and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't know if that's.
Yeah, that's you got to think about how you relate that to elementary kids
Totally. And so, it's a great opportunity. And so what that story presents for us is teachers stop and they say, wait a minute, how are we really going to teach this to kids? And so then what I do is I teach it to them and say, listen, here's what it is. This book is more than about a prophet being told to marry a prostitute. That's what the story is. The story behind the story is about a relentless God who pursues a wayward church. It's about a relentless God who loves lost people. And that's, so then what we did is then we told it in an age appropriate way about the relentless love of God for you and for me. And I think what that does is that helps, no matter what curriculum that you're in, is that when you say, okay, here's what our focus is, here's where we're going, what it allows you to do is it allows you to help, as God works in you and you begin to teach your teachers, it allows them to see. So that way, when they communicate it to the kids, it's different than it was. And I think that's what I wasn't doing before. I was just handing them curriculum, and then telling them to teach it. I wasn't taking the time to say, here's how we do it. Here's what we want to accomplish. Here's what we're trying to say. Is Jesus clearly seen? Is the Trinity, clearly seen in what we do? Is the Father at work in the Holy Spirit? Are we just giving them? Are we just only teaching them one person? Are we just teaching them about Jesus, or are we teaching them about the Father and about the Holy Spirit and how they interrelate to each other?
Yeah. So you leaned in more in teaching teachers, coaching them, is what I'm hearing too. Because that was one of the first things I thought was, Redeemer's a larger church in a sense. It's not that change in you really wouldn't probably help across the entire church, especially with multiple campuses, if it just stayed in you. Somehow you could help pass that on. And so it sounds like you've leaned into teachers, anybody that's teaching the Bible more. Yeah. And maybe even personally. Is that the case? Yeah.
So I meet with our multi-site leaders at least twice a month, but usually we talk at least once a week. And so that's always part of our conversation. It's not just how do we accomplish what we're trying to accomplish that week, the logistics of things, which it is, but it's also, how are we clearly presenting to our teachers and to our leaders, the story behind the story, the gospel to them in such a way that it's compelling to kids. Because the thing I strongly believe is that the kids will not leave the loves of this world until they have a love that's greater than this world, than anything in this world that they find. And you see that so clearly in the writings of C.S. Lewis, is the whole idea of a love that is greater than any love you could ever experience here on earth, absorbing and reordering. That's what Saint Augustine said, that it's that our love for God reorders every other love, and I think that's what has to happen in the life of every kid. Is that salvation is more than just a raising your hand and saying a prayer, which it is, but it's also a reordering of every single love in your life based upon a love for God that surpasses everything else. And so every week I used to try to do leaders training meetings and stuff, and just as much as I do, 10 people come out, for those. And so what we did, one of the changes we made about 8 years ago is we do a meeting in between. We do 2 services. And so we do a meeting in between there. And it's in that meeting that I talk about the lesson. I kind of train them about, here's what we're talking about. Here's some things that are coming up. So it's not like some vision things. And then it's also some, I go over our Beatitudes. We have 4 Beatitudes that we try to maintain in our kids ministry. So it's vision, it's practical, and then it's also here's what the story behind the story is this week.
That's good. Because I think that is probably the difficult part is training up other leaders, because it is easier to just hand curriculum, right? Especially if somebody's already good as a teacher, here you go, and you're good to go. But you're right, we miss so much if we don't adapt it, change it, own it, and
totally
kind of coach them.
There is no perfect curriculum. I mean, there's great ones. I mean, we have when you look at I think that's one thing that's changed over the last 20 years too, is that 20 years ago, the curriculum was very, there wasn't as many great options, I don't believe, for curriculum. And now there's just so many great ones that, that fit your church so well, and I think that's one of the mistakes that people make in picking curriculum, is that they choose one that they like instead of what fits my church best. And you find the curriculum that fits your church best, and then what you do is you tweak the parts of it to make it your own in such a way that kids know that it's your heart being conveyed, not just just words being read from a paper. You're trying to take your life experience, the things that God's done in you, and convey that to a child through the aid and the help of whatever curriculum is that you use.
That's good. One thing you've written about and talked about before, and it kind of goes back to the numbers thing that we were talking about, that if you're only watching numbers as a CEO because you're just worried about the bottom line, then you can get too focused on that. And even sometimes it can be maybe not as extreme. Maybe you really do care. It's about fruit, and you really do care about the fruit and reaching people and sharing the gospel. However, that's, that alone doesn't make a church grow. Doing our part doesn't always make a church grow, right? And so you talk about faithfulness over fruitfulness.
Sure.
And so I'd love to hear you, expand on that a little bit and talk about your journey as you've learned that.
Yeah, I think just like we talked about before, I came to this understanding that it was that fun and games and excitement and invitations and outreach and stuff all have their place, but it can't be the only thing that we do. Because if you do that, what happens is that you create this unhealthy idea of what ministry is. You start to measure yourself by fruitfulness. How much, you know what I mean? Instead of God, help me to patiently endure, in the middle of nowhere. And I think you kind of see this in the sense of that when people want to go to a church, a lot of times they want to go to a bigger one than the one they were in. In kids ministry, I mean, this isn't like everyone, but a lot of times you see it's no one goes from a bigger church to a smaller church, generally speaking, because you
change jobs. You mean
they're always going to a bigger church, and I'm not judging the motives of every person that's doing that, but I think it's indicative of our culture that says bigger is always better, and in America, that is a mantra that is preached to our culture, and I think the church has bought into that too much. Bigger isn't necessarily always better, the goal of what we're supposed to be doing as pastors and accomplishing is not how can I get more people? It's how can I be faithful to where God has called me in such a way that I reach as many people as possible. And so I think you still get to the same point, but it's what is the starting point that makes all the difference between faithfulness and fruitfulness. If my starting point is my relationship with Jesus Christ and saying, God, help me to be faithful where you've planted me in such a way that I reach every single person around me, you still are concerned about lost people. You're still concerned about people far from God. You're still concerned about growing the church in such a way that God is glorified. But the end result is not your wisdom, and it isn't because of your leadership ability alone. It isn't because of your strategies and all these amazing little things that you did. It's saying, I submitted my life to Christ. I followed him in humble obedience, and God grew the church. And when you look in the New Testament, you see it's a passage I think that we find frightening, but I think that is there for us to bring such comfort, is that God grows the church. He grows the church. It is our job to be faithful. We water, we plant, God brings the increase. And we don't like that because we like to control the outcomes of our life and of our things, because that's what we all struggle with, is God, I want to control the outcome. And God's saying, listen, you plant, you water, I'll take care of the increase. And I think if we water right, and if we plant right, and we focus on the things that we can do in our relationship with Christ and our relationship with others, I think God will do exceedingly abundantly above all we could ask or think, more than we could imagine. And I think that's where I think the church has slipped into this whole fallacy, I think, of being a CEO versus being a shepherd. And I personally think that you are called as a pastor to be a shepherd, not a CEO.
Yeah, and probably that was the thing. Nobody ever thought of a pastor as a CEO a few decades ago, right? That's really only the last few decades. And you're saying we've taken that too far, probably.
No, a shepherd, I think, and I know some people say that a shepherd was like an entrepreneur and stuff, and that may be true. I mean, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I think, to me, when I read the Bible and different historical things, they're under shepherds. They generally didn't own the sheep. They like David. He didn't own that flock. His father did. Mm-hmm. Is that his job was to be faithful to those sheep because he was working on behalf of his father. And I think in pastoring, it's the same way. We are not owners. We are stewards. And anytime we get this idea that I own this or this belongs to me, right? What happens is that it erodes the sovereignty of who God is, right? It's God owns it all. The Bible goes out of its way to say that everything that we have is a gift from God. And when we fail to see the things in our life as good gifts from him, we start to slip into this idea of entitlement. I deserve, I earned, I worked, instead of God graciously gave by his loving hand everything that I need. And I think that is the difference between a pastor and a CEO. A CEO is about how can I organize people and lead people, and believe me, I'm just as guilty. I mean, there's many years I read more leadership books than I read about anything else. And we need good leaders. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you should be a crummy leader and be a pastor. Absolutely not. You should be a strong leader. You should be a talented and gifted leader. But here's the thing: is if you don't know who you're following, then you're leading someone. You're leading the people that are following you somewhere else.
Yeah, which is dangerous. Very dangerous.
It is. It's very dangerous, and it's very dangerous in the church. And for me, it became a personal point of conviction that I don't read as many leadership books, and I read more about the person I'm following and less about how to lead and inspire, and in some cases manipulate the people that are leading that are following me. So that, to me, that's what it sort of became, is a conviction that God help me to be a better follower of you so I can be a better lover of people.
The other thing I think that is probably helpful with the conversation about fruitful and faithful is that there are plenty of people listening who they are faithful and they're doing the work and their church isn't growing, and they just need to focus on the faithfulness, right? I mean, they need to not, again, try to take ownership of the growth and the fruit.
Well, I think the tendency in those cases, which are very frustrating, and I don't deny that at all. I mean, I've been there. We all have, and is to look at the outcome and blame God and say, God, why isn't there more people? You promised this. And instead of saying, okay, God, how is my watering? How is my planting? Instead of blaming God for the outcome and saying, why isn't there more people? Say, God, how well am I planting? How well am I following? How well am I loving you? God, help me to be faithful in difficult seasons, and that would be my, my plea to many people who are frustrated in the churches that they're in is don't let your first reflex be to leave. Let it be, God, what are you trying to get at in me? And then if you need to leave, then leave. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying stay in there forever. What I mean is our first reflex needs to be not, this isn't working. It's, God, what are you working at in me? And I think that makes a big difference in how we approach the difficulty of what feels like fruitlessness, but you see all through history, you see people that changed the tide of history and of nations that really affected and impacted one person. And so that's the thing, is that we feel like, someone once said they're talking about how the way that we look at our lives is almost like there's like I think it's like 29 frames per second in a movie. It's like you take one of those frames, which is 1/29th of a second. You take it, you try to judge the whole movie by that one frame, and you'll come up with a totally wrong conclusion.
Yeah.
And what we fail to realize is that God is the author, the screenwriter, the playwright. He knows how many prequels and sequels and everything. When he looks at that one frame, he knows everything about it. And we just see that one frame and we judge and we think God got it wrong. And I think that's the tendency with us, is to say, you know what, God, you got it wrong. You got it wrong. I'm in the wrong place. You got it wrong. I'm not doing the right thing. Instead of digging deeper into him, saying, God, help me to trust you in such a way that I forget myself. That I forget myself and not focus so much on who I am, and focus more on who you are and what you've done.
Now, you mentioned that for you, some of this was a change about 10 years ago. And so what I would love to ask about that is, you got to, lead the ministry for almost 10 years, and then a certain way, and then there was this change, and then you've kind of led it differently. And you mentioned how it's not exactly like a huge difference. Some of it's just the approach and where's your heart. But what did that look like at Redeemer in terms of the before and the after, and how it related to kids and the ministry and fruit and all of that? Was there a big change there? Because I do think sometimes we take too much control of the idea of the fruit and growing the church, that we're afraid to do some of this stuff. You know what I mean? And so, but what happened? You got to see it. You had this change in you, hopefully, led and pushed that to other leaders in the church. And what was the result?
Yeah, well, I think it was a gradual one, which I think is hopeful. It wasn't like we're going to do this now. It was more of like God was at working in me, as he still is to this day. And it was a gradual change that we changed in terms of what we want discipleship to look like, what we want our kids to know, what we want our kids to walk away with. And so it was all these different questions that we were asking. It was like, what is the bottom line that we want every kid in every age group to come away with in our youth ministry, in our kids ministry? What do we want them to know? And so then what you do, then we sort of like started to figure out, okay, what things do we have to put in place so that becomes a reality? That when kids leave our youth ministry and they go to college, that they have a understanding, they have a personal experience with God, but they also have an understanding of the rich history of the church and their deep love for God. That it comes from that they're saved by grace alone and by faith alone in Christ alone. That it isn't anything that they've done that saves them. But that we fight after we're saved. That's when the work kicks in, because we fight to be holy. It's a work with the Holy Spirit that we fight to be holy. So it's this idea of like what changed was how we disciple kids. I would say changed how we teach our lessons, the parts of the lessons that we tweak, because everybody tweaks lessons. The different parts of the lessons that we tweak changed. I would say how we train teachers changed. And I would say the way that we communicated the values that we hold dearest changed. Yeah, and I think those are some of the main things that we changed, and the tools that we gave parents, I think, to help, in partnering with them. I think the tools that we give them changed as well.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that, but generally speaking, I mean, there's still fruit, right? Church still grew, God still did His part. It grew before, because it's not, again, you weren't saying, hey, that we were doing it and it was evil. No, you just were maybe leaning a little bit this way, so now you made sure you leaned the other way, and in both cases, God has grown. But now you would say, I would think the church is healthier, the ministry is healthier.
Right, and it is, and I think it is right now. I'm telling you that right now, but the problem is as I look back over 20 years, I see the mistakes I made, and I have legitimate regrets, and I think, Nick, I think in those regrets aren't bad, because they keep you humble, and they keep you connected to Christ, and they keep you from being harsh with other people. Because here's the reality is I see other people making the same mistakes I made, and I don't. My job isn't to go out and say you're wrong. My job is to say, God help them, and if an opportunity comes up to say something, I will. But if not, I'll just pray. And because I know that God was gracious with me when I had, I wasn't doing everything that I should, and some of the regrets that I have, in making Christ clear to kids. I still I think of kids by faith that I didn't preach the gospel clearly enough to, and that are struggling right now. And I know that God's grace is greater, and I do know that, and I know that He, that they heard the message, but I feel like God helped me for that never to be the case going forward. And so I think there is, I think there, that's sort of, there are some regrets, but you understand the grace of God is greater than, those things. But those things, I think they help you. Those regrets help you to stay humble and to say, I don't have all the answers, but I know who the answer is, and I know what He's done for me. And I know that going forward, like 10 years from now, I'll look back at this conversation that we're having, and I'll think that, I'll have regrets about what I'm telling you right now. And then that's the beautiful thing, right?
Yeah. And a lot of what we're talking about too is, and what you're saying, I think, is take full ownership of what's in our control, but make sure we don't go too far. We don't grow, God grows. So we fully own what's our responsibility, what we can control, but at the same time, don't try to take any ownership of what God controls and His grace and all of that. And that's what makes it hard. See, it'd be really easy if it was, you just do this and like in an equation almost. It's not. It's just, messy. It's messy, and trying to figure out that balance. And you mentioned how you help parents. And I think that's another one. Like, that's another area where it's like, okay, parents, and we were talking about this before we record. Yes, parents need to lead their kids in matters of faith, and the church needs to help. And that's another one of these tensions where you can't solve it, because we've been there where the church is the only one that does it. That doesn't work. If the parents are the only one who does it, we know from statistics that doesn't help either. They have other influences. So what does that look like at Redeemer? What have you changed? How's your philosophy maybe changed as it relates to helping parents lead their kids?
Well, I think, you're totally right, Nick. I think that that it has been in the past, and that it's all the church, and we've seen the pendulum swing back the other way, and I think in some cases it's almost too far, where it's all the parents say, hey, go do this, and but I think that we have to bring it back to the middle, where it's going to be this idea of us and discipling kids and discipling parents, because the reality is there's parents in the world that we live in now. We live in many ways a post-Christian America in many ways, and there's not this background knowledge of even the Bible and the basics that we take for granted. And so what we have to do is we say, okay, what are kids deficient in, and what can we do to help disciple parents and disciple kids at the same time? And for us, that is trying to take a more systematic approach in terms of what we teach the kids on Sunday, in terms of what we give as handouts, in terms of what books we recommend, and different classes that we teach. I think those are the main things that changed. We started doing a catechism weekly with all of our kids from preschool all the way through college, so that we go through the New City Catechism, which is which teaches them like a doctrinal truth based on Scripture, that they memorize from preschool through college. We started offering systematic theology books from preschool all the way through high school, and that teach kids about the Bible and about who God is in a way that they can understand in each age group, at each age level. I'm working right now on a thing to give to parents. We're going to call it First Steps, Next Steps. And so I've been working on that where it gives them, three quick answers to questions they ask most. And then a link to a website that has like an 8-page paper that goes into it further if they want next steps. So, but if they just want a quick answer, like how do I talk to my kids about sex? Like, how do I do devotions at home? Like, what is the gospel? What Bible should I buy for my kids? Questions along those lines. It has like a quick answer, and then there's a longer answer online if they want to go for more. So I think partly what we've learned is that you have to give parents something quick but have something more prepared for later. So that way they can dive deeper if they want to, but they at least have the basics.
Yeah. So that way, like if somebody's not going to spend time, you've still given them something to learn and grow. And then if they are going to spend the time, they're going to take the extra effort. You have something else for them as well.
Yeah.
That's good.
And I think finding out too, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do more is trying to answer questions parents are asking instead of telling them what they need to know. And I think that when you change that paradigm in your mind, say what do parents want to know versus what am I trying to make them understand, that when you switch that, they're much more likely to participate in discipling their kids, and it's a great bridge for you to disciple them,
And you mentioned, systematic theology books all the way down to preschool. I think most people are thinking, what does that look like? Hermeneutics with preschoolers. But, what would be great is what we can do is we can link to the books and things you recommend. We can link to some of that in the show notes, if you can share that. But what does it look like? You just you found some resources that are great, and you give them out. I mean, how is it something where it's available, or do you really push it to parents certain times of the year? How do you make sure you keep getting this stuff in front of them?
Well, it's what I generally do is we have like 4 books actually that go from preschool to high school. And when parents ask questions about God, like how do I talk to them about this or that or whatever, I usually point them to those books that we have available in our church. We have like a small bookshelf of different books that we recommend, and I point them to those. I say, hey, this is the age of your kids. You should read them this, and what that does is as they read that, they learn the question and the answer to the question themselves. So it helps the kids, but it really helps the parents just as much. And there's tons of great resources out there, that are super helpful to parents. And systematic theology sounds really complicated, but the way that each of these books are written, they're beautifully illustrated. They're simple to read. They're short and they're age appropriate. It's not as smart and crazy and theologically deep as it sounds. But it's incredibly helpful to create a foundation, because kids need a foundation. And if they don't have a foundation, what happens is they're going to fall victim to this postmodern idea of who God is, where they say, all truth, even including in the Bible, is relative. It's what the parts of the Bible that speak to me that I accept, instead of saying the Bible is the Word of God. And we have to get back to a greater sense of biblical literacy within our kids and a greater understanding of who God is and what He's done for them, in order for them to weather the storm that's coming.
I'd love to hear how you're approaching training parents, because I think a lot of churches, like you said, the pendulum has swung to where we're leaning into parents leading their kids more. But I think people are realizing, kind of like you're saying, a lot of them need more help. Not only do we need to take more ownership too of leading kids and discipling kids, but plenty of parents are new. It's post-Christian, like you said. And so they're realizing that there's a gap in their church where we're giving parents resources and equipping them with, with ways to help lead their kids, but we're not really training them. So what does that look like for you guys? You're recommending some of these resources, but do you do specific trainings? Like what else do you do to help parents practically grow?
Well, we do like baby dedications, and at different times in their life where there's events, we try to tap into those. So we have that, and we one of the things we're trying to do again this fall is I'm going to try to do like like a parenting small group, this spring, we're going to do like a parenting small group or a parenting class. I'm not sure where I'm going to hold it, but we're looking at doing that in terms of like, especially for younger parents, trying to get them at the beginning to try to say, okay, here's some of the things that we're going to try to do. We're going to try. One of the things I'm trying to do is figure out how we can help parents to reinstitute the whole idea of family worship. Like, how do we reinstitute, the idea of family worship that had been practiced within Christianity for hundreds of years, but hasn't for the last 100 years or so, 150 years. This idea of that our family is a small church, and we worship God together, isn't really a reality that is made its way into the church large, but also our church. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out by doing that with my own family is how do we help parents pastor their kids, and create the idea of we are devoted to God first and foremost. And we do that, not just something we do on Sunday, but it's something that we do throughout the week. So
that's good. And I think a lot of churches are kind of like you're saying, trying some different things, trying to figure out what's going to be the best way to help parents, because you're right. That's where we need to lean in. We can't just pass it off. And I think given the resources, everything is really helpful. I, as a parent, use, the resources we give at our church, but how can we help them grow and learn how to make it real at home? Family worship is a good example of something I could do that for many parents don't even thinking about. I don't even know what that is or what that looks like. How do I do that?
Yeah, and it's a practice that's really died out. I mean, it used to be a big hallmark of, and especially in the first Great Awakening, it was, and throughout all of church history, it has been. And so it's how do we reinstitute that? Another thing we're starting to offer for our parents, for the high school kids is going to the summit. It's a worldview. Basically a worldview training camp, basically for high school kids before they go to college. It's like an immersive 2-week event where they go to like a camp for 2 weeks, and the whole thing they're talking about is what does a Christian worldview look like. And so they walk through different books by like Nancy Pearcey and just different people talking about what worldview looks like and what it is, and so that way when their worldview is challenged in college, they'll be more equipped and more prepared for that. So. That's some of the things.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. That's a really good thing, because you're right. College is where it gets challenged a lot, not just from teaching. In fact, I think it's probably more, I don't know, but to me, I feel like it's more just from the people you're around, other students. And not even necessarily what they're teaching you, but just what their worldview, what they believe, why they believe it. We're seeing that more and more, I think, with students who've graduated from our ministry and now they're in college and they're telling us about their experience. It's like, wow. Okay, we didn't talk a lot about that. We probably should have talked more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think them having an understanding of the world in which, not that everything that we teach them is about, defending their faith and apologetics, but I think that they have to have that aspect. And I think high school is a good time for that to be introduced really strongly, and I think through junior high and preschool and elementary, it needs to really be a love for God. And then, because that will help you once you add that apologetics piece, to not be a jerk, because you love God and you love people. But you really know why you love God. Then you kind of break down the worldview and kind of say, okay, here are these secular mindsets. Here are these things that are trying to, here's what we can take and here's what we can leave. And here's what's true, because one of the things that Nancy Pearcey says, I think that is either her or Francis Schaeffer said, is that all truth is God's truth. And the reality is that there is some true things that people who don't love God have discovered. And it's true, not because they're not, not because they're not Christians, but because all truth is God's truth. When we realize that it all comes from Him and that He reveals Himself to us in general ways and specific ways.
That's great. I love how you, in our conversation, we're hearing just how you've mixed children's ministry, youth ministry, and kind of the things people think about all the time, how to make that work with faith and theology and growing in Christ and being connected, and how you're, helping kids and students do that as well, which is really big. Because I would agree. I think probably the pendulum has swung in a couple ways, maybe too far. Whether it's from, teaching to fun, or the church doing all the work to parents doing all the work. And it seems like a lot of the things we've talked about, the goal is finding that middle ground.
It is the middle. It totally is. And yeah, it absolutely is. And that's the hard part, is because you don't typically realize that you've gone too far till you have, and that's the hard part, and we need more of God's grace, and we need other people in our lives saying, hey, I think you're going a little bit too far. And, and we need those stopgap measures that keep us from swinging too far one way or the other.
Well, I really appreciate all the time. We could probably keep talking about this more and more, especially like what it looks like in your church and your journey and how it's been working in you. But if people want to learn more, and some of the things we talked about, you've written about, so how can they connect with you? And, if they have any questions or they want to learn more.
Sure. I have a really creative title for my blog. It's samluce.com. So you can go there, and I have different blog posts I've written. So I'm coming up on, I think a couple months will be my 10th anniversary of bloggery. So
nice.
So I have I think 1,700 articles or whatever. So you can find stuff there, and then there's there's different things, and I'll put some links in the show. I'll give you some links for the show notes of different books and that kind of thing. So
yeah, that'd be good. People will love that. So we'll link that there. It's really helpful. I love your blog. I've been following for a long time. I don't feel like you.
I appreciate it.
I don't feel like you took my path in that. In that your writing's been good for a long time. I feel like I think I've been writing for like 9 years, and it took a long time for it to be really good. And maybe it was, you just need to look back, kind of like you said early in the conversation. You've been there long enough. You look back and you can see some of your mistakes and do things with that. I feel like that was writing for me. Like I get to go back and like, oh, wow. Yeah, that's not so good.
No.
But watching following other blogs like yourself and Carrie Newhoff and, just good writers, I think it helps. And I'm glad you do it. I'm glad you share your journey. It's really helpful. Cool. Well, Sam, thanks for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate your time. Well, that was a great conversation, wasn't it? I mean, there's just something unique about the perspective of someone who served for almost 2 decades in the same church. Sam's been able to see, kids almost from birth through graduation come through their church. And as he's changed his philosophy and approach to ministry, he's really been able to see how that works or doesn't work, which is a great thing. So I really appreciate his time. Here are a couple action items I think of coming out of that interview. One is you could evaluate your ministry. Ask some hard questions about where you are in that tension between entertaining kids or youth and discipling them. Are you moving back and forth? Are you in the right spot? What could you do to make some changes to be where you want to be there? And a great thing to do might be to ask someone whose kids have been in the ministry a long time, maybe even before you work there. If you haven't been there long enough, I think that'd be a great step. And then also be sure to check out the show notes. We link to those systematic theology books he mentioned for kids from preschool all the way up. They're linked in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 35. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast because next week I interview the team at LCBC Church. Their church is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and has grown rapidly over the past couple decades, really in the past decade, though, because they've gone to 15,000 in average attendance, and they're a multi-site church with 9 locations doing a lot of great things. And what I do is I interview them and someone who was kind of their family next-gen pastor. She's now moved into a different role, but still oversees the children and student pastors who oversee all of what they do at their church for children's ministry and student ministry. And we just kind of break down what they do. I ask a lot of questions about how they serve kids and students, what it looks like practically, how it works at their largest campus of 6,000 or whatever it is, and how it works at some of their smaller campuses of just a couple hundred or a few hundred. So you don't want to miss that. It was a fun conversation. It was the first one I've done with more than one other person on here at the same time, and it was in person. So it was a ton of fun. You don't want to miss that. So be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.